So that's the 21 centimeter radio telescope. It's up on the roof, just up there. This was the original single polarization feed here in the LNA module. It sits on a yoke, basically made from 4x4s, and it's driven by a linear actuator. We had to replace that actuator a few months back. It broke.
Princess Auto?
No, actually, that actuator is from almost 20 years old. I used it on my original 12-foot dish, and it finally packed it in after many, many years. Although, you know, it sat around doing nothing for many years, but it provided service for about a year driving this thing in really poor weather conditions. I think what happened was that water got in and froze and broke some parts inside, and it was cheaper to get an entirely new actuator than to try to repair it. So we got a new actuator that's actually much heavier duty, and we got a rubber boot for it to keep the rain out. So it's one of those accordion boots, and it's in service now. Carlton offered to pay for it, so we didn't refuse. So this is it now with the new dual polarization feed assembly on it. There's a new waveguide feed horn and the two LNA assemblies connecting to the two probes. You can see this down here. That's the dual polarization feed in the lab. So the dual polarization, you've got probes into the waveguide, and they're at 90-degree angles. So they're looking at two different polarizations of the electromagnetics. Because hydrogen in general is only very, very weakly polarized, if at all, what that means is that any given hydrogen photon is randomly polarized, which means that with a single polarization feed, you're only getting about half of those photons. So with dual polarization, you're getting both of them, and so you end up with an improvement in sensitivity. And at the same time we did this, we moved to slightly better low noise amplifiers, so they're probably about 10 or 15 Kelvin quieter than the ones that were up there.
Is there any point in going to a circularly polarized thing? No?
No, circular polarization is somewhat artificial. It's something that humans do. And a circularly polarized feed, there's a 3 dB penalty, right? So, I mean, you'd have to have two orthogonal circular polarization feeds. There's really no reason to do that for a natural phenomenon like this. For satellites, it matters because cross-polarization losses can be quite high. But for us, linear polarization in two of them is fine. So pulsar infrastructure, we're still working on it. That's the dish out there that I'll take you guys to see in a bit. It was put in, when did we put it in, Gary? In the fall?
No, it wasn't in almost spring, late spring?
Maybe it was late spring. Yeah, we've been playing with it for a while.
It was over more, remember? Then
Oh yeah, we moved it around a bit, and yeah.
Walkway.
So we've tried various feeds here for various frequencies. The problem with the frequencies that are ideal for pulsar observing, particularly on a small dish, is that they're heavily contaminated with low-level radio frequency interference. So we've been trying different frequency ranges, which necessitates different feed arrangements. The latest feed we have on there is optimized for around 430 megahertz, which is, some observers will note, the ham radio 70 centimeter band, but that turns out to be in general less polluted than the other bands which are used commercially. So it's actually a better choice. Even though there is notionally ham radio activity there, there's not much of it around here.
What are the bands that you're able to use right now in terms of what's quiet and where the
well, 21 centimeters, because it is reserved for radio astronomy and nobody has stomped on it, so we do most of our observing there. It's more or less useless for us for pulsars though. It's too high in frequency. There's the synchrotron radiation, which is what pulsars are. There's a spectral curve that drops off precipitously above about 1 gigahertz because of the underlying physics. So even though 21 centimeters is actually quite quiet here, which is what you'd expect, it's not useful for pulsar observing, unless we had a very much bigger dish. We tried 611 megahertz, which is notionally reserved for radio astronomy, but there's a lot of secondary emissions in that band. So that's actually TV channel 37, which was in ITU Region 2, which is North America and the Caribbean. It has been reserved since the 60s for radio astronomy, but in practice it's usually quite noisy from other things, from secondary allocations in the channel, because it's not, I think radio astronomy is primary with potential secondary, and there's incredible pressure on that little 6 megahertz chunk by cell phone providers.
It's a so-called digital dividend.
Right.
It's a dividend to them, but.
Yeah. So we're still kind of hunting around for both an ideal frequency range and more advanced processing in the software to try and eliminate RFI using cleverness.
What frequency is the 21 centimeter then?
That's 1420 megahertz, so 1420.4058 megahertz. Yeah.
Just down below the GPS frequency.
Yeah, GPS is at 1575.42, I think.
The standard hydrogen line, though.
Yeah, hydrogen line is at 1420. Yeah, 21 centimeters equals the hydrogen line. Yeah. Although in practice it's not a line in observations, but yeah, at rest in the laboratory it would be at 1420.4058. So control room infrastructure, we did quite a few upgrades this past year. These guys came from surplus at the Diefenbunker, and we snatched them when they became available, and we've been populating them, actually even since this picture was taken. A lot more organizing and more equipment, more receivers that we built, and computers to go with them, and that sort of thing. Basically having a capability there so that if you decide you want to do an experiment, there's resources available to do it in the receiver room. And we are starting to work on shielding the room. I have one panel of shielding up here now that was just an experiment to see how easy it would be to get it to go up and sort of not look horrible. I don't think I've perfected the not look horrible part yet, but what are you gonna do?
How about those blinking lights?
The blinking lights, we have a few blinking lights. Mostly in the routers. The routers have blinking lights, but a lot of modern equipment doesn't have blinking lights.
No,
It just sits there quietly and you don't even know if it's working or not. It's a modern world. But, I mean, we just saw a video from 1966 and there were racks and racks and racks of equipment with blinking lights and vacuum tubes and just stuff. And a lot of that is condensed, down to something like that these days. So, there's trade-offs.
More room for lights.
Hey, if you want to do a blinking lights project for us,
Okay.
then sure.
So it's not
It probably doesn't even
centimeter
have to
range.
do anything real. It can just be for gawking tourists.
Are you
We can
partial to LEDs versus bulbs?
Bulbs would be cool in a retro sense, but LEDs last a lot longer, so, yeah.
We did get a laser engraver recently.
Yeah, well, we'll show that when we do the tour of the machine shop.
Gives us some
So, 2019, we did accomplish a bunch of stuff, but it wasn't without a certain amount of existential anxiety. There was a serious fire in late spring of 2019 in another part of the campus, not around here. This garnered a lot of attention from the Ontario Fire Marshal's office.
Doesn't he have a crush on you?
Maybe. I think that's what Marnie said, yeah. So we originally sublet here for those of you who were here last year, we sublet from a guy who was running an airsoft range here. So guys, weekend warriors running around shooting each other with pellet guns. The fire marshal came through and looked at what he was doing and said, you can't do that here, not without all of these upgrades. He wasn't able to meet those requirements. The Galapos, the main landlords weren't able to meet those requirements within a budget that was reasonable. So he left kind of precipitously in July, And for a good chunk of the summer, our future here was actually quite uncertain, because we weren't sure whether we'd be allowed to stay, despite our notional landlord having left, plus the uncertainty about the meeting the fire requirements imposed by the fire marshal, all of that stuff. We just weren't sure. But that mostly settled down, and we ended up negotiating directly with the Galapos to stay here, and then MSEC, who has an operation over there, they decided to lease the other part of this this section here. So they do, interestingly enough, and purely by coincidence, they do electromagnetic compatibility testing, and they design Faraday cage enclosures, and they do testing and that kind of stuff. And they're kind of, compatible with us in a sense. We can speak RF, and they know what it means, and all that kind of stuff. So that ended up being kind of cool. But it's had its upsides. We have better access. We used to not be able to go up on the roof on weekends because that's when his shooters were out, shooting each other. We couldn't go up, we'd get shot. Now, of course, we don't have that problem. We've been able to put our own signage up. I don't know, notice when you came in, we got a really nice sign above the reception desk. All of that stuff we're now able to do because we have, better access to the facility, and nobody's blocking us from doing that. So overall it's been a positive experience, but there was a definite amount of uncertainty in the summer, which is part of the reason that we didn't pursue the doing the build out at FLO, because we weren't even sure that we were going to continue to operate. We had a lot of other things we needed to take care of. So.
There's still a retirement home or whatever in the other part of this?
Well,
facility?
the other part of the campus has been converted into condos, basically.
Condos, yeah.
Yeah, and that's their main thing. That the condos are kind of a creeping fungus that will slowly creep backwards towards this building. But that's not going to happen for a good long time.